Back around the turn of the 20th century, life in America was a whole lot different than today. Not only were the clothes and the lifestyles different, but our understanding of many things was in its infancy. The state of modern aviation consisted of the Wright brothers trying to get their bicycle to fly. Early automotive pioneers were trying to keep the wheels from falling off what would eventually become the horseless carriages. A scientist named Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen had just discovered X-rays. As you can see from this photograph, we had no idea then that radiation protection should even be a consideration. The light bulb above the table is an X-ray tube, and everyone in the room is getting irradiated just to take an X-ray of a patient's arm. And we were just beginning to explore the fundamentals of genetics. So our grasp of radiation and heredity factors, the two key concepts necessary to understanding the potentially harmful effects of radiation to an embryo fetus, was less sophisticated than the Model T Ford. But in 1904, a zoologist at Columbia University named Thomas Morgan began building the foundation of our understanding of genetics. From 1904 through the 1920s, while studying 13 million fruit flies, he and his co-workers were able to map the insect's chromosomes and identify the actual locations where the different characteristics of the fly were determined. His discovery was so significant that he's often credited with writing the fundamental rules of heredity. But while Morgan's discovery was a scientific leap forward, he still didn't understand what the genetic material was or how it is replicated in cell division. So we were out of the genetic dark ages, but still had much to learn. Meanwhile, back on the radiation protection front, it wasn't until 1913 that the earliest protection recommendations were made to provide 2 millimeters of lead shielding to the X-ray tube operator. And this was just a suggestion, not a rule or regulation. X-ray machines were virtually the only radiation source used in the workplace at the time, and our radiation measurement techniques were really primitive. We used something called the skin reddening or skin erythema dose. As shocking as it may seem by today's standards, this was the amount of exposure required to cause human skin to actually turn red like a sunburn. That would be about 600 Roentgens of exposure by today's standards. If that sounds incredible, remember we had no idea back then that after the sunburn healed, there might be some long-term biological damage associated with radiation exposure. In 1925, we started to get a little more serious and scientific about radiation protection and evaluated several well-protected medical institutions where the same workers had been using X-ray machines for several years and had suffered no ill effects. It was calculated that these workers received no more than about 1 skin erythema or skin reddening dose over a year's time, and these working conditions were thought to be safe. It was then suggested that to be on the conservative side, we establish a yearly tolerance dose that was 1/10 of the skin reddening dose. If you're curious, this would be about 60 Roentgens per year in today's units. 2 years later, in 1927, our understanding of the potentially harmful effects of radiation and its effect on genetics began to gel. H.J. Muller published an article in the journal Science entitled Artificial Transmutation of the Gene. Using radiation, he was able to cause a change, a mutation, in the genetic structure of the fruit fly by exposing it to ionizing radiation. So, for the first time, we were able to document genetic damage as a direct result of radiation exposure. Another milestone occurred in 1928 when the International X-ray Units Committee met in Stockholm, Sweden, and adopted the Röntgen as the standard unit to measure X-rays and gamma rays. This new physical unit was based on ionization produced in air rather than the perceived biological effect of reddening of the human skin. For the first time, we were able to measure the radiation output of the source, which was a big step forward in measuring and quantifying radiation. We could now measure the strength of a source in a reproducible way. As a result, in 1931, the guidelines for radiation exposure for workers were changed from 1/10 skin reddening dose per year to 2/10 Roentgens per day, and reduced further in 1936 to 1/10 Roentgen per day. This is 20 times less than an annual skin reddening dose that was considered safe 10 years earlier when well-protected medical institutions were surveyed. This was significant in that it was the first major reduction in radiation protection recommendations with no evidence that any worker ever suffered any ill effect from the radiation exposure. By 1940, researchers were becoming more and more interested in the potential genetic effects of ionizing radiation. And there was a serious suggestion that the committee change the allowable exposure standard by a factor of 5 because of genetic concerns. However, the other committee members decided that the recommendation was too arbitrary and that there was insufficient data to support any change. Then, in December of 1941, America went to war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
And radiation protection was hidden under the name health physics. Our understanding of radiation and its potential grew rapidly during this period. The Manhattan Project separated uranium isotopes in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Physicists worked on designs of atomic bombs in Los Alamos. And we built reactors at Hanford, Washington, to produce the artificial element plutonium, which proved to be a better bomb-building material than uranium. Throughout this period, the radiation protection standard remained at 0.1 Roentgen per day with no observed ill effects. One really amazing sidebar to this story was that the government asked the media, newspapers, magazines, radio, and newsreels, not to use words like atom, nuclear, isotopes, and radiation to maintain national security. And the media complied out of a sense of patriotism on a national scale. What's the chance of that happening today? In 1946, at the end of the war, the Advisory Committee on X-ray and Radium Protection was reorganized and renamed the National Committee on Radiation Protection, NCRP, which is still our national authority on radiological matters today. By this time, the use of radiation for medical and industrial purposes had the potential to increase dramatically. We were now able to produce a wide variety of radioactive sources for medicine and industry using nuclear reactors and particle accelerators. As a result of this projected increase of radioactive sources in the workplace, the NCRP became concerned about possible exploitation of the increasing number of radiation workers. While the development and use of radiation increased significantly through the 1940s, geneticists made relatively little progress. They just weren't able to determine what the genetic material was that controlled heredity or how it was replicated in cell division. The prevalent theory at the time was that the proteins in the cell were the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity. But evidence was accumulating that deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, was the answer. In 1951, a 24-year-old American geneticist named James Watson was working on DNA at Cambridge University in England with a British physicist, Francis Crick. One day, Watson decided to visit physicist Rosalind Franklin at King's College in London, who was also interested in DNA. She showed him an X-ray photograph of DNA using a process that we now know as X-ray crystallography. This was a major influence in Watson's thinking because he realized for the first time that the DNA molecule was helical in shape, much like a spiral staircase. On his return to Cambridge, he shared his excitement with Crick, and they began to build models of what they thought DNA might look like. They knew that the basis of DNA, adenine and thymine, along with cytosine and guanine, occurred in pairs. One day, while trying to gain a better understanding of what he had learned, Watson was cutting out cardboard replicas of the pairs. And when he put the adenine-thymine pair alongside the cytosine-guanine pair, he realized that the two pairs had essentially the same shape. Suddenly, understanding heredity became simple. With this perfect symmetry, before cell division occurs, the DNA molecule unzips, and either half contains all the information necessary for the cell to rebuild each half into two complete sets of hereditary information. one for each of the two new cells being formed. In other words, the missing half of each spiral staircase can be rebuilt using the existing half as a template. In 1953, Watson and Crick published their findings in Nature and shocked the scientific world community. Essentially, they had discovered one of the secrets of the universe, for which they won the Nobel Prize. Meanwhile, back on the radiation protection side of our story, in 1954, another new radiation safety concept was introduced. It seemed logical that the general public, visitors to facilities using radiation sources, should have a lower limit of acceptable exposure than workers. And a dose limit of 1/10 the occupational worker limit was established for visitors. That same reasoning led us to conclude in 1957 that an embryo fetus should also be considered a visitor. And the same 1/10 occupational limit was established for pregnant workers. Around this time, the radiation protection community was becoming concerned about the impact radiation workers' occupational exposures might have on the gene pool of our population. So the recommendation was changed from 0.3 Roentgen per week to our current 5 rem per year. But it's important to understand that the NCRP report said this recommendation was not the result of positive evidence of damage due to the use of the earlier permissible dose levels, but rather are based on the desire to bring the maximum permissible dose into accord with the trends of scientific opinion. It is recognized that there are still many uncertainties in the available data and information. We have to remember that we were in the midst of a Cold War weapons race. Nuclear weapons were being tested in the desert. School children were being taught to duck for cover in the event of a nuclear attack. And Hollywood had much to say about zombie-like mutants that glow in the dark. But our concern was not just driven by public opinion pressure. More genetic data on the fruit fly was becoming available, along with some data from mouse experiments. The data from these experiments showed that the dose effect curve over a wide range was linear down to 37 Roentgens in the mouse and 25 Roentgens in the fruit fly over several orders of magnitude. And geneticists at the time believed that there was no threshold for genetic effects and assumed that in the low dose region, where no data was available, the genetic effect is linear right down to 0. And that's how our current linear, no threshold theory of dose response was born. However, as more and more information became available, we realized that genetic effects were not nearly as important as we thought they were. Concern about the potential damage that occupational radiation exposure might have on the gene pool of our population was replaced with worry that the low-level radiation exposure would increase the probability of cancer in our radiation workers. And it was at this juncture that we turned our attention to cancer as the most probable health-related concern when working around radiation sources. Why is all this so important to you when making an informed decision about the potential effects of occupational levels of exposure to an embryo fetus? Because gaining a fundamental understanding of genetics is necessary before you can understand the potential radiation-related health risks for future unborn children. For example, you need to understand where our damaged genes or mutations come from. We inherit our first parcel of mutations from our parents. More result from our encountering environmental factors during our lifetime that change the structure of our DNA, like smoking, or we make them ourselves. Remember, Watson and Crick taught us that a mutation is nothing more than a simple error occurring in nature when a cell is copied. And with every cell in your body containing 3 billion code sequences of these adenine-thymine and cytosine-guanine pairs, it's easy to understand the potential for these copying errors to occur when cells divide. And during your lifetime, countless billions of cell divisions will occur, each one susceptible to a copying error or mutation. It's important to assess how many of these copying errors occur naturally and how many might be produced by your occupational exposure to ionizing radiation. Well, for many years, the National Academy of Sciences and the United Nations Scientific Committee on Atomic Radiation have produced a series of reports trying to answer that question. the world's leading scientists have studied the genetic impact of low-level occupational exposure. Let's take a brief look at their current estimates. In 1 million live births, we would expect to see about 10,000 clinically significant genetic disorders from natural causes with no occupational radiation exposure involved. That is, 1 out of every 100 children can be expected to have a clinically significant birth defect without any occupational radiation exposure, a 1% chance. Now, if each of those 2 million parents were to receive a radiation exposure of 1 rem prior to conception, their expected number of genetic defects would rise from about 1% to about 1.01%. Given these estimates, or scientific guesses, should you and your partner each receive an occupational dose of 300 millirem prior to conception, the probability of your offspring suffering a clinically significant genetic disorder would increase from 1% to 1.003%. That's an increase of 3/1000ths of 1%. But remember, that's only true if the scientific estimates and the linear no-threshold model are both correct. In terms of scientific facts, recent evidence from the studies of genetic damage among atomic bomb survivors suggests that humans are less sensitive to radiation-induced genetic effects than had previously been suspected. Indeed, it has been suggested that had we known in the mid-1950s what we know now, our maximum permissible dose might not have been reduced from 0.3 rem per week, or 15 rem per year, to the current 5 rem per year. Okay. Now that you have some perspective about the potential for radiation-related genetic disorders from your workplace exposure, let's examine the possible teratogenic effects of exposure directly to an embryo fetus. Studies documenting biological damage to the embryo fetus have been performed on animals, and we have proven that substantial doses of radiation to pregnant rodents do cause a wide range of problems. But the only human data we have is from atomic bomb survivors. Those studies show some evidence of small head size, retardation, and lowered IQ. Severe retardation occurred in weeks 8 through 15, and to a lesser extent in the 16 through 25-week gestational age range. The bottom line of these Japanese studies is good news for occupational workers. We have seen absolutely no evidence of mental retardation in those mothers who received less than 40 rads. And recent analysis of the in utero exposure of mothers with an average dose of 18 rads were not linked to any increase in childhood cancers. We've also followed children born to the atomic bomb survivors, but who were not in utero when their parents were exposed. 30,000 individuals whose parents received more than 10 rem developed 43 cancers. The control group of over 40,000 whose parents were not exposed had 49 cancers. So the resulting data showed no increase of cancer in offspring of exposed parents. Does this mean that we can say conclusively that there is no increased risk to the embryo fetus of a pregnant worker? No, because the exact quantification of effects is still subject to some uncertainty. And considering this uncertainty, we've adopted a prudent and admittedly conservative position that leads to risk estimates that are probably too high rather than estimates that future data may show to be too low. The NRC has implemented the current NCRP recommendation of limiting embryo fetus exposure to 500 millirem spread over the entire pregnancy. All right. Now you've got a fundamental understanding of how mutations occur and can produce genetic defects. And you're up to date on the relative risks of occupational exposure to the embryo fetus. So you should be in a better position to make a decision for your unborn child regarding its potential increased risk, especially if your continuing occupational radiation exposure typically exceeds the nominal 50 millirem per month limit that a declaration of pregnancy would impose. But there's more to the decision of whether to declare a pregnancy to your employer than safety-related concerns. The net effect of the additional dose limitations may mean that you won't be permitted to perform some of your normal job functions. In that case, you may want to ask your supervisor for a job that doesn't involve any radiation exposure at all until the birth of your child. You may want to discuss your job status, short and long term, with your employer before declaring a pregnancy. Many, if not most employees, are able to continue with their normal job duties because most employees receive 9-month doses that are well below the 0.5 rem level. You must declare your pregnancy in writing to your employer. Be sure to include the date, your name, statement of declaration, and estimated month of conception. It's not necessary to provide medical proof of your pregnancy, but you must declare in writing. Even if your employer notices that you are pregnant, or you tell them you're pregnant, that is not sufficient notification for a declaration.
And we'll make sure that your young unborn does not have anything close to the exposure limit.
The reduced limit from a declared pregnancy remains in effect until your employer knows you've given birth, or until you inform your employer that you're no longer pregnant, or if you no longer wish to be declared pregnant. In other words, you have the option of submitting a written revocation of your declaration at any time during your pregnancy. While there are no NRC requirements that address false declarations of pregnancy to achieve lower occupational exposures, the regulatory agencies have no way of preventing your employer from taking action against you for deliberately lying. We know that the relative risk of occupational radiation exposure is small when compared to other avoidable risks and workplace hazards. We know that too much alcohol can lead to the tragic consequence we call fetal alcohol syndrome, the most common cause of mental retardation in babies. We know that 1 or 2 drinks a few times a week may produce children who have learning problems. Smokers are more likely to have an ectopic pregnancy that has started to grow outside the uterus, a serious threat to the mother's life. In addition, smoking doubles the probability of sudden infant death syndrome. Whether you do make the decision to declare your pregnancy or not, your obstetrician has available a wealth of information to help you have a healthy baby. Everything you are right now is in your genes. Our 46 chromosomes contain the 50,000 to 100,000 genes that make each one of us separate and unique. The Human Genome Project's goal is to locate each gene's specific place on our chromosomes, so that we can better understand how genes affect the body, both in health and disease. When we reflect back on scientific milestones, the 20th century belonged to physics. But it looks like the 21st century will belong to genetics and biology. We've learned a tremendous amount about a lot of things over the past 100 years. But remember, in all of our research, we've never been able to document a single radiation-induced health problem associated with occupational radiation exposure. If you want more details, NRC Regulatory Guide 8.13 is an excellent source of additional information. Thanks for watching.